Hello students, today I am going to introduce to you another module on learning, specifically theories of learning 2, in which we shall discuss about instrumental conditioning. The main objectives of this module are to understand the principles of instrumental conditioning, the concepts of reinforcement and punishment, and application of principles of instrumental conditioning to daily life. In this section, we will consider another important type of conditioning, which is instrumental conditioning, that is, learning to associate behaviors with their consequences. Suppose if a student is rewarded with praise every time she raises her hand in class, she becomes more likely to raise her hand again in future. If she is also scolded when she speaks out of turn, she becomes less likely to interrupt the class. In these examples, the teacher is using reinforcement to strengthen the hand raising behavior and punishment to weaken the talking out of turn behavior. Behaviors that are reinforced, that is, which lead to satisfying consequences, will be strengthened, and behaviors that are punished, that is, which lead to unsatisfying consequences, will be weakened. The behavior that is reinforced or punished is referred to as the operant response because it operates on the environment by bringing about certain consequences. That is why instrumental conditioning is also known as operant conditioning, as we are constantly operating on our environment and learning from the consequences of our behavior. Satisfying consequences will lead you to act that way again in the future. Unsatisfying consequences will lead you to change your behavior. Research on how we learn associations between behaviors and their consequences started around the beginning of the 20th century. American psychologist Edward Thorndike studied the ability of cats and other animals to learn to escape from puzzle boxes. In these puzzle boxes, there was usually only one way to get out. For example, pressing a lever would open the door. Thorndike would put a hungry animal in the box, place food outside the box but in sight of the animal, and then record the animal's behavior. If the animal pressed the lever, as a result of its behavior, it would manage to escape the box and get the food, that is, satisfying effect. The animal would tend to repeat such successful behaviors in the future when put back into the box. However, other behaviors, for example, pushing the door that did not lead to escaping and getting the food, would not be repeated. Based on the results of these puzzle box experiments, Thorndike developed what he termed the law of effect. That is, any behavior that results in satisfying consequences tends to be repeated, and any behavior that results in unsatisfying consequences tends not to be repeated. In the 1930s, B.F. Skinner, the most influential of all behaviorists, redefined the law in more objective terms and started the scientific examination of how we learn through operant conditioning. To understand how operant conditioning works, we first need to learn Skinner's redefinitions of Thorndike's subjective terms, that is, satisfying and unsatisfying consequences. A reinforcer is defined as a stimulus that increases the probability of a prior response, and a punisher as a stimulus that decreases the probability of a prior response. Therefore, reinforcement is defined as the process by which the probability of a response is increased by the presentation of a reinforcer following the response, and punishment as the process by which the probability of a response is decreased by the presentation of a punisher following the response. Reinforcement and punishment are terms that refer to the process by which certain stimuli, that is consequences, change the probability of a behavior. Reinforcer and punisher are terms that refer to the specific stimuli, that is consequences, that are used to strengthen or weaken the behavior. If you operantly conditioned your pet dog to sit by giving her a food treat each time she sat, the food treat would be the reinforcer, and the process of increasing the dog's sitting behavior by using this reinforcer would be called reinforcement. Timing affects learning. If there is a significant delay between a behavior and its consequences, conditioning is very difficult. This is true for both reinforcing and punishing consequences. The learner tends to associate reinforcement or punishment with recent behavior, and if there is a delay, the learner will have engaged in many other behaviors during the delay. Thus, a more recent behavior is more likely to be associated with the consequences, hindering the conditioning process. Positive reinforcement. In positive reinforcement, the consequences of a behavior are positive. So, the behavior is engaged in more frequently. In the early 1960s, a team of preschool teachers conducted a classic study in which they helped a young girl overcome her shyness that has become a widely cited example of the principle of positive reinforcement. The teachers were worried because the girl spent little time playing with the other children and too much time with her adult teachers. They decided to encourage peer play through positive reinforcement. They knew that she enjoyed receiving praise from the teachers. So, they decided to praise her only when she was playing with another child. To be able to evaluate the results of their positive reinforcement program, the teachers first counted the frequency with which the little girl interacted with other children and with adults before anything was done to help her. Then they started to positively reinforce her by praising her for playing with other children, but otherwise they paid very little attention to her. The little girl's frequency of playing with peers increased markedly when the teachers reinforced her. To be sure that the positive reinforcement and not some other factor was responsible for the changes, the teachers stopped reinforcing her for playing with peers and then reinforced her again during the last phase. Thus, the teachers were able to intentionally teach this child a more adaptive pattern of play by using positive reinforcement. Two important issues in the use of positive reinforcement should be noted. 1. Timing. The positive reinforcer must be given within a short time following the response, or learning will progress very slowly, if at all. The greater the delay between the response and the reinforcer, the slower the learning. This phenomenon has been referred to as the principle of delay of reinforcement. 2. Consistency in the delivery of reinforcement. For learning to take place, the individual providing positive reinforcement must consistently give it after every response in the initial stages. However, after some learning has taken place, it is not always necessary or even desirable to reinforce every response. Primary and secondary reinforcement. Two types of positive reinforcement should be distinguished: primary and secondary reinforcement. Primary reinforcers are innately reinforcing and do not have to be acquired through learning. Secondary reinforcers, which play a very important role in operant conditioning, are learned through classical conditioning. Schedules of positive reinforcement. As if every response were always followed by a reinforcer, a situation known as continuous reinforcement. However, the world is not always so simple. In addition to continuous reinforcement, psychologists have described 4 types of schedules of reinforcement and have shown us the effects of each on behavior. 1. Fixed ratio. On a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, the reinforcer is given only after a specified number of responses. 2. Variable ratio. On a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, the reinforcer is obtained only after a variable number of responses have been made. 3. Fixed interval. Here, the schedule of reinforcement is not based on the number of responses, but on the passage of time. 4. Variable interval. Finally, there is a schedule of reinforcement in which the first response made after a variable amount of time is reinforced. Like the variable ratio schedule, this variable interval schedule produces high rates of study response, and although it is not a good schedule for initial learning, it produces highly stable performance when the response has already been partially learnt through continuous reinforcement. Behavior modification techniques. In this Skinner box designed for rats, the response under study is lever pressing. Food pellets, which serve as reinforcers, are delivered into the food cup on the left. The speaker and light permit manipulations of visual and auditory stimuli, and the electric grid gives the experimenter control over negative consequences, that is mild shock in the box. Shaping. Shaping, or the method of successive approximations, refers to rewarding closer and closer approximations of the behavior until the desired behavior is finally learned. Shaping allows you to build this desired behavior in steps and reward those behaviors that come progressively closer to the one you have selected as the final goal. B.F. Skinner trained 2 pigeons to play ping pong by applying operant conditioning principles. Chaining. Chaining is closely related to shaping. In chaining, a series of behaviors called a response chain must be performed to get the reward. Examples of chaining. The chaining of a sequence of actions should be so exact that the chain could work forward or backwards to make sense of an event or tasks. Forward chaining is the most logical sequence to consider first. Here is an example of forward chaining to help a student learn to do homework tasks. Clear homework desk, then open bag, then get homework books, then get a pen, then do first task, then finish all required tasks, and lastly pack books back in the bag. Backward chaining illustrates how a sequence also works in reverse. Here is an example of backward chaining for a child learning to get dressed to go outside on a cold day. Put on a hat, put on coat, put on shoes, put on socks, pull on pants, put on shirt, put on underpants. Negative reinforcement. Operant learning based on negative reinforcement plays an important role in influencing our behavior. Suppose your roommate plays his stereo so loud that it has kept you awake every night this week. If you assertively ask him to turn it down and the loud music stops, you will be more likely to act assertively in the future. So, from the previous example, the loud music was the negative thing that your assertive behavior got rid of. Two types of conditioning are based on negative reinforcement. 1. Escape conditioning. In escape conditioning, the behavior causes the negative event to stop. 2. Avoidance conditioning. In the other form of negative reinforcement called avoidance conditioning, the behavior has the consequence of causing something negative not to happen when it otherwise would have happened. Punishment. Sometimes the consequence of behavior is negative, and as a result the frequency of that behavior decreases. In other words, the behavior has been punished. Punishment is a negative consequence that leads to a reduction in the frequency of the behavior that produced it. When appropriately used, punishment can be an ethical and valuable tool for discouraging inappropriate behavior. In our society, however, physical punishment is still used with children by parents, teachers, and others in authority. Dangers of punishment. 5 dangers are inherent in punishment. 1. The use of punishment is often reinforcing to the punisher. 2. Punishment often has a generalized inhibiting effect on the individual. Repeatedly beating a child for talking back to you may lead the child to quit talking to you or stop playing with you altogether. 3. We commonly react to physical punishment by learning to dislike the person who inflicts the pain, and sometimes by reacting aggressively toward that person. Thus, punishment may solve one problem but only lead to a worse problem, that is aggression. 4. What we think is punishment is not always effective in punishing the behavior. Most teachers and parents particularly think that criticism will punish the behavior at which it is aimed. For example, some teachers and parents see a behavior they do not like and criticize to get rid of it. But children's actions are sometimes reinforced by the attention they receive when criticized. In this way, the criticism reinforces rather than punishes the behavior, and the criticized behavior increases in frequency. 5. Even when punishment is effective in suppressing an inappropriate behavior, it does not teach the individual how to act more appropriately. Progress is made only when appropriate behaviors are taught to the individual to replace the inappropriate ones through positive reinforcement. Guidelines for the use of punishment. In some situations, punishment is a necessary method of changing behavior. For example, in teaching a young child not to run out into a busy street, punishment may be the only method that makes sense. In these instances, however, every effort should be made to minimize the negative side effects of punishment by following some guidelines for its use. 1. Do not use physical punishment. Physical punishment usually backfires and causes children to behave worse rather than better. 2. Punish the inappropriate behavior immediately. 3. Make it clear to the individual what behavior you are punishing and remove all threat of punishment as soon as that behavior stops. Do not punish people, punish specific behaviors and stop punishing when the inappropriate behavior stops. 4. Do not mix punishment with rewards for the same behavior. For example, do not punish a child for fighting and then apologetically hug and kiss the child you just have punished. So, to summarize, in today's lesson, we have understood about the origins and definition of instrumental conditioning, positive reinforcement, primary and secondary reinforcement, schedules of positive reinforcement, concept of shaping or method of successive approximation, concept of chaining, in which we discussed about forward and backward chaining, negative reinforcement, wherein we examined escape and avoidance conditioning, and lastly punishment, its guidelines and its dangers.